Horror, to me, has always seemed like a difficult thing to get right in animation. I'm not talking about horror as a genre here, but as a feeling. The thing that scares and unnerves, sends chills down your spine and gets your skin crawling in response to the uncanny and the unknown. And there are few animated shows that can get that reaction out of me. And as I've gotten older, they've only gotten more difficult to find. It's not something that affects animation generally. I've talked in detail about how the uncanny nature of stop motion can be eerie to watch, and I think CGI is more than capable of making its own frights, but 2D animation has always struggled to feel truly scary. I think part of it comes from 2D animation's tendency towards simplification. Art generally requires an artist to simplify the world around them into abstracted lines and shapes to start their work. And it's no different for animation, whose fundamental principles are similarly built around simplifying and exaggerating the way things and people move, whether it be how limbs swing in arcs or how physics squashes and stretches things whether they want to or not. In both cases, a sense of realism is achieved by building up enough layers of these simplifications and abstractions until it either mimics our reality or is given enough detail to feel like one unto itself. But 2D animation rarely has the luxury to build that many layers. While there are exceptions, its production generally requires its artists to draw efficiently, either because of the time and effort needed for the hundreds or thousands of frames that go into the simplest of animations, or in the limitations that the schedules and budgets they're under force them to work with. And in my experience, even when an animated work is able to go nuts, the way it comes out often leaves me more impressed than horrified, either because of the unique way its monsters have been stylized, or because of just how beautifully animated its grotesque moments are. 2D animations need to simplify, abstract, and stylize while, ironically, being one of the greatest strengths of the medium in my opinion, is also part of what makes it so difficult to find scary, because it feels more like a caricature of what should be horrifying instead of something that actually is. But that doesn't mean it can't be done. I'm not the first person to talk about this, but I've always found the conclusions many reach on this topic to be dismissive, seemingly believing that because it's difficult it must not be possible, or just lacking, especially when trying to counter that last part by pointing out that because it's horrifying in concept it must be horrifying inherently, which I think ignores how much the impact of a piece of media comes not just from what happens, but how it happens. Something I think is clear to see even in mediums built around telling you their story word by word. And what makes it even more frustrating is how much the subjectivity of horror itself gets overlooked, cause different things scare different people in different ways. What might for one person be a neat design could very easily be for someone with, say, arachnophobia, nightmare fuel. Certain kinds of horror aren't going to affect someone who's desensitized to it, like how the common turn to gore in a lot of horror anime, for me, as someone who's grown up on a steady diet of slasher flicks and zombie films I really shouldn't have been watching in retrospect, just doesn't do much. And hell, the things that might have scared someone as a kid are naturally going to affect what unnerves them as an adult. Or it does for me, anyway. There's just a lot more nuance to this discussion that I don't think gets acknowledged, and it feels like it's hampered many people's ability to recognize and appreciate the technical efforts in many 2D animations to achieve that feeling of horror. So, how can 2D animation be scary? Of course, I can only really speak from my experiences here, but I think there are a lot of different ways different works can horrify with different kinds of scares. One of the more obvious ways is to lean into a more realistic style. I think a lot of the principles of animation, great as they are, tend to stifle a work's ability to horrify because of the way their focus on exaggeration makes things feel less real and thus harder to take seriously in that way. It's why things like Jin-Ro tend to have more of an impact. Though not a horror film, it's filled with many scenes that are, for me, horrifying, particularly in its depiction of violence, which, over the top as it can be, is rendered in viscerally graphic detail, as protesters and bystanders alike are beaten and broken by an oppressive police force and ripped to shreds by the bullets of its titular Wolf Brigade. The film's more realistic animation grounds its world, and more specifically its violence, making the threat that comes with it more tangible. But it doesn't need to be realistic to take seriously, as there are some types of horror I think the principles of animation are weirdly well equipped to handle. Specifically, body horror. There's just something about 2D animation that captures the grotesque physical contortions of the subgenre so well in so many different works, even in ones I wouldn't have expected it from. And of course, I think the best example of it is in Akira, whose third act sees one of its main characters transform into a putrid mass of flesh and muscles, practically melting across what was once meant to be an Olympic stadium. medium, absorbing everyone nearby into his bloating body and popping them like grapes as his newfound form spreads like a tumor. A lot of the details that make this mutation so impactful are in the way it squashes and stretches, swings in heavy arcs whose weight is emphasized by slow ease-ins and quick ease-outs, how it's filled with all kinds of opportunities for secondary motion, and even something as minor as how the many shapes that make up its mass are effectively circles, which tend to be the easiest shape to apply the principles of animation to. For as much as they can hinder 2D's ability to scare, there are situations where they can work to its benefit. But it doesn't need to come from the animation itself, as I think a lot can be done with an unappealing design, or more specifically, one that goes against the principle of animation known as appeal, which, to greatly oversimplify, is a general rule of thumb to make a design likable and or interesting in some way, shape or form. But by skewing the details that contribute to it, a design can just as easily become eerie or downright uncomfortable to watch. And it's something I think is easy to see in the most horrifying animated monster designs. Whether it be a dead-eyed stare or twisting something familiar into a nightmare, there's lots of ways an unappealing design can rattle one to their core. And I think a good example comes from the man-bat monstrosities known as Chiropterans from Blood the Last Vampire. Their disproportionate bodies and faces hit this sweet spot between animalistic and humanoid, giving them an uncanny air that's only made stronger not only by their transition from one to the other, as their facade slowly stretches and strains in all kinds of unnatural ways, but also by how the film for so long only gives glimpses of what they truly look like. And even when it does, they're often shrouded in shadows, building up the mystery around their true form to a breaking point. I think a truly unappealing design goes a long way to make a 2D animation unsettling. That feeling can even be put into the very aesthetic of a work, which I think is exemplified by Flowers of Evil. Though more of a fucked up drama than a full-blown horror, it still leans into the kind of dread that comes with it, which is only made worse by its animation, which is entirely rotoscoped. For as off-putting as it may be at first glance, I think it actually adds a lot to the experience. The real-world details that come from its live-action footage bleed into every part of the animation, from the proportions to the perspectives to even the subtlety of its actors' micro-expressions. But the layer of 2D abstraction just throws me for a loop, as I keep expecting more traditional animation techniques to take over, and the dissonance it leaves me with makes even the smallest of details that much more unsettling, whether it be someone's animation literally stopping or noticing an uncanny background detail. And I think it's quite fitting for this show specifically, since in a lot of ways it reflects the main character's attempts to quite literally oversimplify the world and people around him as he starts to become aware of their respective intricacies. For the sake of maintaining an understanding of it all, he's too scared to let go of. A form of unappeal, for lack of a better word, can be achieved by creating a visual style built around some kind of aesthetic dissonance, which can actively discomfort and, as a result, heighten the horror it's trying to convey. It doesn't even need to do it all the time to achieve this, as a lot of animated works only step outside their comfort zone for their horrifying elements, either by layering them with subtle filters that give their monsters more texture to stand out, or by switching mediums entirely for the sake of a good scare. Though, considering how often this can go very wrong, and the fact that this video is meant to be about 2D animation specifically, that last part does feel like cheating a little. And it's something I think Madoka Magica, which, though not a flat-out horror, is still pretty dark, does well with its labyrinths. That's right, I'm mentioning this thing 2 videos in a row, baby! When a character enters these supernatural domains, everything around them warps into a different aesthetic, full of janky papercraft looking monsters and design flourishes that make it feel like a demented storybook come to life. A wild shift from the general flat cel-shaded look of the rest of the show. By presenting its horror in a way that doesn't mesh with the work's aesthetic, it emphasizes the otherworldly nature of said horror by making it literally look unnatural in-world. And that disconnect doesn't need to be purely aesthetic. Lots of works start off with a lighter atmosphere that endears people to its characters before pulling the rug out from under them, whether it be a moe blob slice of life suddenly turning into a post-apocalyptic zombie horror, or an almost Ghibli-esque fancy adventure slowly delving into more depraved and existentially chilling depths as it goes on. But the one that got me recently was Wandering Witch, whose tonal disconnect feels more like constant whiplash than a proper bait and switch. It starts off fun enough, establishing the magical qualities of its world and the easygoing ego of its main heroine before, in episode 3, It fluctuates between these lighter and darker tones throughout and only builds them as it goes, heightening the effect of both through contrast, which reached its peak for me in episode 9, when, after deciding to take up a job to help a fellow witch go back in time to save her friend's family from a gruesome murder, it reveals that the friend herself had been the murderer the whole time in the most grotesque way it can. That hard switch also made this episode one of the few times that gore in an anime actually managed to get to me. By starting off with a lighthearted atmosphere, a work can heighten the impact of the horror it indulges in later through the tonal contrast that comes with it. And it sort of goes to show that for as much as I can go on about the technical details of the art and animation, there's just as much in everything surrounding them that can affect its horror, which I think is a big part of what adds to the tension of the first season of The Promised Neverland. For me, its greatest strength comes from how it frames its characters in such a way to put the audience in their shoes, whether it be the camera lingering and far away in partially hidden places, emphasizing that feeling of your every move being watched and every word being listened in on, or the amount of space it leaves in frame to emphasize how small even the older children are in comparison to this big, mysterious world, something that's only made more apparent by the sheer presence it gives to its demonic overseers, who practically consume the frame when they appear, as if they're so big only parts of them can ever fit on screen at a time. Hell, even something as simple as focusing on the children's own reactions with close-up shots and subtle animations helps hit home how terrifying their situation is. The series' use of framing and cinematography puts the audience in the shoes of its central characters by emphasizing their experience with the world around them, thus making it easier to feel their fear as things start to go wrong. And it's part of what, among a lot of other things, has made its second season so lacking for me. That dread that came from its visual direction feels lost, replaced instead with a more standard approach that just doesn't have the same impact. And while I understand it's become a new kind of story in this particular arc, I still feel the details of it, with the kids now needing to survive in this wilderness full of even more dangers than they can imagine lurking around every corner, while also being hunted by demons both professional and casual alike, would be the perfect place to lean even harder into the kind of direction it had taken in the first season, or even using that presence the demons originally had to create an uncomfortable dissonance that emphasizes the weirdness of this demonic world, which I think could have been especially effective when showing the more ironically human side. The switch in direction has made the second season of The Promised Neverland feel lackluster for me, as it's lost a big part of what made its first season so impactful. But the original idea that made it work, of using the medium to put the audience in the character's shoes, is also what I think makes Perfect Blue work so well. As the film goes on, its main character becomes increasingly worried about her slipping grasp on reality, and the film's editing perfectly reflects that fear, as its transitions and cuts between scenes and shots increasingly leaves the audience at a loss as to when and where any given part of the story takes place, or whether it's even happening at all, disorienting the viewer in the same way the main character is living through it. It's a subtle thing, but it does a lot to discomfort me with how little room it gives to get a solid answer out of any given moment of the film. And weirdly, I think that lack of context can also be helped along by, of all things, a lack of resolution. A lot of older works have an edge in this regard for me, since with their often lacking visual quality, the gap of information it leaves makes it easy for me to fill them in with whatever details my mind can come up with. It's part of why, when watching Wicked City, one of the more concerningly horny and honestly just straight up rapey horror things I watched, I found the lower quality VHS version to be a far more horrifying experience than the high quality DVD one. It's hard to explain, but it's the same kind of feeling you might get from seeing a humanoid figure in the dark. It's not inherently a problem, but the lack of context you have for it leaves so much room for your imagination to explore and find the worst possible conclusions about why this strange person is here, waiting in the dark, just for you to stumble in, completely unaware of their presence, assuming they're a person at all. The lacking visual quality many older works have due to their age obscures the specifics of its imagery, which I think can make them more unnerving to watch because of the way one's imagination fills the gaps with details more horrifying than anything anyone could have drawn in. But what I think has the biggest impact on the horror of an animated work that doesn't seem to get enough credit is sound design. Now, I'm not much of an hourly inclined person, so beyond saying it sounds good, I don't think there's a lot I can go into detail with in this regard. But I do notice the difference between a soundscape that's just sort of standard, and one that feels like it's been given the kind of consideration needed for horror. And it's something I really appreciate about Mononoke. Not that one. There's a lot of cool things this series does for its anthological horror, but the thing that stood out to me the most is just how much of its sound emphasizes the off-kilter nature of its many stories and settings. Whether it be the painful silences filled only with sounds that don't belong, or the way it slowly crescendos to a genuinely upsetting fever pitch as it dives headfirst into all the surreal nightmare fuel it can muster. The soundscape of an animated work is an effective way of conveying a mood or tone on what for me feels like an almost intuitive level. But at the end of the day, I don't think any of these details would matter much without the initial fears they're trying to draw on. Every example I've mentioned here is in its own way built around specific fears and phobias, both relatable and highly specific. And I think the best horrors, both generally and in animation, are the ones most effectively able to use the medium to tap directly into the panic and dread those fears bring. And I think it's also why it's become so difficult for me to get that feeling of horror from them anymore. When I was younger and had far less of an understanding of the world and what exists in it, the smallest things could give me the biggest frights. But as I've gotten older and gained more context and perspective on the world around me and the media I consume, it's made it harder for even the most bone-chilling of works to get to me in the same way they used to, animated or not. That's not to say I don't still enjoy them. In fact, that growing knowledge has brought with it a new kind of appreciation for these works. But it's just not the same. And for as much as I can tell myself that that's just how things are, that my connection to and experience with things will naturally change with time and age, it doesn't make it any less disheartening to realize. I sometimes wonder if there's any media that'd be able to truly horrify me anymore. And the thing is, there is one show that's come pretty damn close. Serial Experiments Lain is an original anime series created by Yasuyuki Ueda and produced by Triangle staff about Lain, a 14-year-old girl who, after getting an email from someone who'd committed suicide, finds herself drawn into a web of conspiracy and digital hauntings to unravel a mystery whose rabbit hole goes far deeper than she had initially thought, and it is the most horrifying animated series I've watched in a long time. It almost feels like it was made specifically to scare me, which isn't helped by the fact that it came out the same year I was born. And you may be wondering, was this video an excuse to talk about an old anime series I liked that I didn't know how to market as a video by itself? Well, nearly every aspect of Serial Experiments Lain's presentation just unnerves me. It's filled with all kinds of uncanny and uncomfortable imagery that lingers long after they've left the screen. Its pacing and direction is slow, methodical, and limited, leaving little room for me or the characters to fully understand what's going on, as if trapped by a lack of information. Something that's only made worse by the way the crisscrossing wires dangling overhead in nearly every scene seems to cage them all in. Its soundscape is defined both by nauseating electrical hums and dead silence that lets every little movement echo into the distance. Nearly every light and bright spot in the show has this blinding glare like a computer screen that bleeds into every scene and practically washes out every bit of color and detail from the environment, sometimes quite literally, whilst the shadows are filled with these colorful splotches that give them an unnatural depth I could fall into. Every part of its aesthetic and direction adds to this unsettling atmosphere of a haunted world filled with all kinds of highly specific nightmare fuel and off-putting visual detail so heavily influenced by the digital technology that's slowly taking over its world. And I think that's the point, because at the core of Serial Experiments Lain's story is a deep-rooted fear of how little separation there is between the real world and the digital world. It shows how much of an impact people and events in the wired, its equivalent of the internet, can have on the real world, from the rumors and conspiracies that spread like wildfire across it, to the way people try to genuinely harm others through it, to the way it can destroy what little sense of privacy and anonymity people might believe they have on it. And there seems to be little one can do to control it, or even the way people react to you on it, as Lain finds herself stumbling into different versions of her based on the different ways people see and understand her on the wired. And to me, so much of it seems almost prophetic in how effectively it predicts the impact the internet and social media could and do have on our world. And what makes it all worse is the simple fact that the ones who deal with all these issues are kids, leaving the younger generations who grow up on these technologies to solve the issues the adults who created them didn't even consider as a possibility, or worse, actively sought to exploit. And what makes it scarier for me is that while Lain and the other kids may not have fully embraced this tech until they were a bit older, I've been surrounded by it my entire life. My reality has been defined by a near constant connection to the internet in some way, shape, or form. And for those born after me, that connection has only gotten stronger. Its horror is rooted in the fears that come with the rise of an interconnected age, something that with the state of the world generally has only gotten more relevant, and whose concerns about the influence it can have on reality as a whole in one way or another have already become all too familiar. But what strikes a nerve for me personally is how much I relate to Lain. She comes across as a shy and nervous kid with a small group of friends she's barely able to talk to and who she struggles to really connect with. But in The Wired, she finds it much easier to open up and talk to others, to stand up for herself and be assertive, and to more effectively express herself. It gives her a sense of comfort and control she simply lacks in the real world. And as someone who's always struggled with social anxiety, even when talking to friends and family, and who's similarly found it much easier to connect with people online, where that digital screen almost acts as a buffer to give me room to breathe and time to collect my thoughts, it's something that just hits quite close to home. But for Lain, it's not simply an easier alternative, it's an obsession. She surrounds herself with technology to strengthen her digital presence, actively choosing her artificial existence over her real one, ignoring the feelings of those close to her for the sake of her own sense of control. And it's not just Lain who's obsessed with the comfort it brings, as is a constant concern that many characters in the series struggle with. And it's something that Lain ultimately gives into, as in the end, rather than go through the difficult process of having to confront and rebuild her relationships with those she's distanced herself from, she opts instead to simply wipe herself from everyone's memory, and effectively remove herself from existence. What scares me about Serial Experiments Lain is the profound loneliness that defines its characters. One so disconnected and isolated from the real world that they choose to literally lose themselves in an artificial one. One where they can control every variable of their experience and block out everything that upsets them until there's nothing left. Until there's no one left. Until their own anxieties and insecurities leave them all alone. And to me, that idea is simply horrifying. For as complicated as can be to achieve, I think it's more than possible to create a genuine feeling of horror through 2D animation. But like any good horror, it requires one to not only break the rules of what's considered good by the medium standards, but also to do so in service of tapping into and forcing us to confront our deep-rooted personal and collective fears. And while there are plenty of shows and films that struggle to hit that balance, I think there are also just as many that are able to do it, sometimes without even meaning to. And I think the artistry that goes into getting it right is something that needs a little bit more appreciation. And yeah, those are my thoughts. Man, I've been sitting on this one for literally years, and I'm glad I can finally get around to it. It probably would have been more fitting for a Halloween video, but with the amount of horror-based anime airing, like Jujutsu Kaisen and Promised Neverland, I figured now's as good a time as any to just get it done. Granted, I wish I could have talked about Jujutsu Kaisen at all, but honestly I could probably dedicate a whole last video to that thing. And maybe I will at some point, who knows. Also, it was a fun excuse to fiddle with video structure a little, since, and I'm not sure how obvious this is, I tried writing this with a 3-act structure in mind to see how it would work, and I gotta say, I'm honestly kind of surprised by how much it clicked for me. Just one of those things that makes it easier to break up this big thing into smaller chunks, and I think it gave it a pretty distinct flow compared to my other stuff. I will say though, this thing ended up spiraling out of hand word count wise as I started to actually write it, cause jeez, there's so much to talk about and I barely even managed to scratch the surface. Which is kinda disappointing cause I was hoping this would be a shorter one, but God has cursed me for my hubris, as the meme says. Anyway, hope you are staying safe, keeping your distance, washing your hands, wearing a mask, etc. And let me know what you think. If you agree, disagree, how you feel about horror and animation in anime, if there's anything I missed here you think's also got quite a horrifying edge to it, etc. And thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this and want to see more, then check out my last video where I talk about what I think makes time loops so unique as a storytelling trope. Or watch me ramble about all my top things of fall 2020. And don't forget to like, comment, share, and of course, subscribe to come fly with me. Hit the bell to stay notified, follow me on Twitter for more updates, ramblings, and poor attempts of humor, follow me on Instagram for semi-regular art stuff, and hopefully, I'll see you later.